So, about Jack, first of all, I have to say we're incredibly lucky to have him tonight here because we've been trying to do this talk for about almost 2 years now. The first time poor Jack's been cancelled, I don't know how many times, and the first time was because of a flood. Yeah.
No, just before COVID.
It was the flood, and then it was COVID, and then it was COVID again because it got we went back into lockdown. So it's been a bit of a saga. But the interesting thing is that a lot of things have happened since I first asked you, because this last few months in your career have been quite eventful. So we're getting a different talk than we probably would have had when we should have had it. So I just want to introduce Jack very quickly. Jack was born and raised in Mansfield, and that fact has had a very important impact on his work. The kind of growing up in this particular place and at that particular time. So he left to go study his art school. He went to the very prestigious Central St. Martin's in London. And while he was there doing the 3 years, he took a break to go to Paris, to the Beaux-Arts in Paris. And apparently that was a very lovely time, but it was more about a movable feast and lots of living. But I'm sure it produced some amazing works as well. But beginning in 2015, Jack had a succession of shows in London and in the Midlands and in France. And as I was saying, his career has taken on a new momentum very recently because of certain shows he's been in. He was in the lovely Bold Tendencies show in Peckham, which took place despite all the restrictions. And on the back of that, he also submitted a piece at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition, which was accepted, but he also received an award for that, which was the Arts Club Award. And so that's been quite an eventful few months. But in his work, Jack is very interested in the ideas of aspiration and cultural dissemination. And he draws his motifs from aesthetic ideas of luxury and the societies that reinforce it. He questions and examines ideas of form and beauty in regard to the place they occupy and the objects in which we indulge. So he uses building materials alongside bespoke processes to simulate and distort the decorative decisions we make in our homes and gardens every day. So as you'll see through decisions, reactions and imitation, his work draws heavily from the classical civilization through to the more obscure symbols and aspirations revived from his 90s childhood in the Midlands. Familiar trips to B&Q, package holidays, this kind of humble things that have really marked his work and the way he sees himself. So I will let Jack tell you the important bits. All over to you.
So I'm going to start this presentation back in Mansfield. As Anne said, Mansfield's a place that means a lot to me. I grew up there for 18 years and then left and came to London and had a very different, life facing me. Going to art school in London compared to the sort of more suburban setting that I'd been used to. So here we go. I'd like to start talking about Mansfield, a smallish town in North Nottinghamshire where I was born and grew up until leaving for London after I finished my foundation in 2012. So this is a picture of Mansfield. This is just a sort of general overview of the town. In a way, much of the work I make couldn't exist without the topography of Mansfield and my experiences growing up there. Mansfield is an old mining town which, like so many other northern towns, was once bustling and prosperous, only to be hit the hardest once the pits were closed. This is Clipston Colliery, a village next to Mansfield which had and still has the highest headstocks in all of Europe. My dad worked as an electrician down the pit and is now a builder. I've never been down a pit and it holds a great mystery to me. I cannot imagine leaving school at 16 to work in such an intense environment. In my teenage years, I would go to work on building site as a labourer during the school holidays. I would mostly be loading out bricks and tiles, and sometimes, if I was lucky enough, I was allowed to make concrete. If you didn't get it right, they would tell you in no uncertain terms. Mansfield is an incredible football club known affectionately as the Stags. We're 18th in League Two, which doesn't sound too bad, but it's actually the 4th tier of English football. Field Mill, where we play, is officially the oldest professional football ground in the world. I did my foundation at a local college, West Notts, and it was the first place I'd ever made any sculptural work. I spent most of my time here in the dark room, but this is one of the first ever sculptural pieces I ever made. I was obsessed with Andy Warhol and pop art, and I guess this piece is my homage to Warhol eating a hamburger, as well as me wanting to make things on a beefed up scale. Direct reproduction scale is something I use a lot throughout my work. Chapter 2, Chairs. I've had a love of chairs for as long as I can remember. My grandpa and grandma used to live in Brighton and had all sorts of designer chairs. Eames lounges, Togo sofas and Barcelona chairs. For a long while I wanted to be a furniture designer, but this sort of faded away while I was doing my foundation. I really didn't get on with my 3D tutor. Ever since though, chairs have remained a constant presence throughout my practice. This piece here that you can see on your screens is my final degree show work that I made after finishing at the end of St Martin's in 2015. It's called 220 degree cure, and that name relates to the temperature that the plastic is formed at in the injection moulding for these chairs, and then the cure element comes from the process of the concrete curing. It's made up of 16 plastic chairs sinking through concrete arranged in a 4x4 grid. Before I talk about the work, I'm going to talk about how I got there. The basis for this work was an image that seared into my mind from 2006. England fans in Stuttgart who had been watching the England-Sweden match in the Stuttgart's main stair started fighting with German fans, and this image is the ensuing riot that followed. There is something so iconic about the ubiquity of this chair, from tame garden parties to its now, in my mind, immediate association with Brits abroad and the way it can be found almost anywhere on earth. I first imagined the image of the chair as being some sort of 3D painting, a plastic chair being thrown through a glass window in a Marseille harbour, or something like that would look as if it impacted the glass. Hockney's Bigger Splash immediately came to mind, and I thought about making a flat background paint simulating shards of the glass. So this is the first piece that I made with one of these plastic chairs. I actually stole this plastic chair from a park in Camberwell because they are surprisingly notoriously hard to buy, even though they're so ubiquitous. They sort of come from wholesaler retailers. This is how it ended up. Not quite the drama and mystique of the splash, but a starting point of a framed window and a chair being thrown into ambiguous space. Maybe too ambiguous or too spacey, like it's floating accompanied by Also Sprach Zarathustra in 2001 A Space Odyssey. So this piece is it's what I started with. It was made for a sort of interim exhibition at uni that was happening before the final degree shows. And at this point, again, it was almost like one of the first sculptures I'd made again. After I spent all of my first 2 years at uni purely in the dark rooms again as a video artist and not as a sculptor. And this was an approach that I took through the last probably through the last semester, to try and utilise the facilities and equipment that I had there a bit more. When I was making the painting, it was originally laid down so I could pour the paint on and make it glass smooth. I eventually came back to that image when I started making my degree show. I wanted to recreate the scene from the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey, surrounded by plastic chairs and a monolith made from pebble dash, meaning something about man's downfall from cheap materials and over-reliance on plastic, or something like that. So this is the original foundations of the work. It was going to be a series of chairs surrounding this scene. So this is the scene from 2001. It's the final scene. And this interior is based on a hotel in London. I believe it's Claridge's. The work never made it any further than that previous image because the bureaucrats at Central St Martin's decided that me, an untrained brickie building a 1-ton, 3.4-metre breeze-block wall and then proceeding to launch small pebbles at it in the vicinity of everyone else's work would be a bad idea. What do they know? Anyway, I kept the chair and without really thinking just proceeded to multiply. All I knew was it had to be big and there had to be a lot of them. And that is kind of the approach I took to my practice in the early days, and I guess it's kind of kept going. Here's an arrangement I started playing with based on an image of the hooligans from earlier. I've already started cutting the legs off at this point and did wonder whether to bother casting them in concrete, but please note the 1-ton bag of sand in the background that I would have otherwise had to get rid of. Here's the final composition of the work. It's quite ordered and formal, as each piece was supposed to feel like it had been dug up from 1,000 years in the future. After some apocalyptic event when everything had been destroyed and all that was left was our plastic chairs and other crap that didn't get destroyed by the nukes. Someone asked me why all the concrete was all different colours. I told them because it was meant to be indicative of the different terrain the chairs had come from. That had nothing to do with it. It'd just been too haphazard to mix my concrete consistently. The chairs popped up again in later work, kind of in the same arrangement as I imagined looking at the all-powerful monolith, this time a poster of a Ferrari. And that poster is on a sort of Artex textured background. It's sort of supposed to be like evocative of a teenager's bedroom wall. It's actually sort of like wood chippy sort of style texture to it. And that poster as well, this sort of like idealised vision, is this shower curtain from Lidl, and the whole arrangement of this is supposed to be like a computer screen, a sort of a background and a desktop with layers of different frames within it, sort of realised in this sort of non-digital setting. Again, in a later work I made in September 2018 titled Please Don't Take Me Home, made straight on the back of that glorious pissed-up summer following England's run to the World Cup semi-finals, the times when pubs could have 4 times their capacity in a beer garden and draft pints were so plentiful that people could just throw them in the air. I think looking back to this piece now, it's a really interesting piece because it has a completely different meaning contextually from when I made it. When I made this, it was such a heady, hedonistic summer, sort of something that I'd almost never experienced before. And it was because of the football, and it was like an unprecedented amount of weather, and I guess just times were so different. And this piece was made in a sort of direct relation to the ending of that tournament and the sort of mini grief that. We didn't get that full output of, the full climax of reaching the final or winning the World Cup. And it was sort of like about the loneliness of the aftermath of that summer. But now, seeing it in this context and really looking at it again in terms of COVID, like these pieces have a different level of isolation to them, obviously, from where they've come from. Maybe the chairs will make a resurgence. I imagine this like a HD update of my degree show work, like a graphical update on a computer game, like Doom 1993 becoming Doom 2016. Same game, just a bit gnarlier. Okay, chapter 3 is columns. I bloody love columns. I love ancient Rome, I love ancient Greece, and I bloody love Russell Crowe in Gladiator. I especially love columns in the wrong places. Places like people's front porches on a terrace house in Mansfield. Why shouldn't they have a bloody 2,000-year-old styled set of columns if they want them? Sometime in my teenage years, I was working as a labourer one summer for my dad, and we put these columns on a house. They were properly milled sandstone from a quarry, and each block was properly heavy. I spent a lot of time thinking about Egypt and Rome and how anything ever got done in those times with stones 10 times the size. The truth is much more depressing than my scrawny self was ready for back then. Doesn't this make for such a grand and attractive entrance? The physicality of putting this up is what most endured, but also as I thought more about it over the years and I became much more of a modernist, I didn't understand the need to hark back to such classicism. Then I started thinking about the columns as signifiers of wealth and status. Neoclassical architecture all over the world, it indicates capitalism and power structures, denoting buildings of significance built in the styles of empires of old. I once went in a Valentino store because I loved the surface texture. I later found out it was terrazzo, and I found a way to cast it into a column. The dog is called Fox. It is not my dog, but I thought this would be a great picture because of the dog. The piece that this eventually became is called See You in Hermes. It's not really a real piece, it's more of a sort of studio experiment. But this is one of the first columns that I made. And I sort of imagined that they'd go in as a shop window display for sort of high fashion. The first piece on the right is cast from solid concrete. It probably weighs about 40 kilos. My studio's in a basement downstairs. I'm completely underground at the moment. And this had to be sort of... Basically, I wrapped this in a piece of foam and rolled it down the stairs. And I had to do the same to cast the other one and then roll it back up the stairs so that I could grind it outside. This piece, Exodus, is in my mind the companion piece to the portico I put up with my dad in Mansfield all those years before. It's made from polystyrene that looks like Valentino terrazzo, so I thought it would be pretty neat to shape it into something grander than it really is. When I finished and my dad came to see it, I was thinking of that scene in Star Wars when Darth Vader meets Obi-Wan in A New Hope. He says, "I've been waiting for you, Obi-Wan. We meet again at last. The circle is now complete. When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master. I'm definitely not the master." This is a close-up of the installation shot of the materials. The material's called Jablite, and it's a reconstituted, expanded polystyrene material. And the reason it's this colours is because it's all different pieces of polystyrene and plastic mixed together and then expanded, and it gives it this sort of effect. It's not for any sort of decorative purpose. It's just a pure sort of side product of the recycling process. But as you can see on the next slide, this is the Valentino interior of the store that I first went into. I'd seen obviously the material first, the terrazzo first, and then saw the Jablite, but it's such a incredible match. And even still, seeing it on the photos, you don't sort of realise that it's just polystyrene. But it's a really interesting piece because it looks and feels so visually heavy, but because of the nature of it being polystyrene, the idea is the physicality to install this, is kind of ironic compared to the sandstone pieces. When I was 11, I went on holiday to Las Vegas. This is Caesar's Palace. It probably has something to do with my obsession for columns. Here's me back there a couple of years ago. This is probably one of the best sculptures I never made. At the end of 2018, a friend got in touch with me asking if I wanted to be in a group show in the soon-to-be redeveloped Whiteley shopping centre in London. I went for a site visit and spotted these amazing, almost satanic ram's heads capitals that adorned this once grand department store. Eventually, Selfridges took all of their business and it became a mid-range shopping centre with shops like Sports Direct and Debenhams. And now, obviously, it's been totally carcassed to become luxury flats. I asked the developer if they could save me one of these capitals, but they forgot, and now they're all destroyed. Seeing this ram's head, I immediately thought of the poster for Escape from New York and wanted to make something at that sort of scale, as if the shopping centre was throwing out all its oversized details, giant ram's heads rolling down escalators. Here they are being installed. They're only twice as big as the originals, but were still too big to get upstairs in my studio, so I had to saw their faces off and stick them back together upstairs. They do have a kind of epic film prop feel to them. They're made from fiberglass, so like the plastic chairs, will be virtually indestructible. Hopefully one day someone will find these two in a distant future and imagine a grand empire led by goats or Satan. So now I'm just going to move on to... So this piece originally was called Capital, and then it got reconstituted when Meadow Arts got in touch with me to be part of the group show in Ruins in, I believe, 2018. Or maybe it was 2019, I can't remember what years anything happened anymore. It feels all like one. But anyway, so these have been left outside to rot for a while after the Whiteley show, and they were painted in this sort of white gloss house paint finish originally. And after seeing all the photos of Witley Court, where the Meadow Arts show would be, I decided that it wouldn't be appropriate to carry on, just re-showing them. So I thought it'd be an interesting sort of premise to reconstitute them to fit with the surroundings of Witley Court. It's really confusing to not say Whiteley's and Witley Court. They're kind of the same place, but so it's what I did in terms of the process from this is they were taken back, stripped back down to their original fiberglass finish. And then I've used a Jesmonite finish, a synthetic stone effect finish that's sprayed onto the capitals to match. It's actually a bath stone to match the stone from Witley Court. And then it goes through a process of aging through just using paints, acrylic paints, to sort of make them look older and more fit into the surrounding. So this is them when they're completed and ready to be shipped out. As you can see, there's slight water ingress and other imperfections. And they're just from the manufacturing process. And here it is installed in Witley Court. You'll probably have seen this as it's the lead image for these talks. As you can see, it's a much better kind of subtler match for the stone, and the idea behind doing that was to make something that in the shopping centre. The idea was to make a work that sort of stood out. It was garish. It reflected the sort of setting of that you get in contemporary shopping centres. High polished floors, high polished windows, everything of a shiny high polish. Whereas there's a bit more of a sort of tragic story behind Witley Court, and the work's always going to be dominated by the building rather than, the other way around. So, and the scale as well, being outside and without any sort of visible limit at the top, the scale changes so much. So they, had to become a much subtler piece, almost as if they'd fallen from the architecture within Witley Court. Okay, so part 4 is about leaves, or particularly leaf blocks. This is something that's kind of become my motif, and I'm going to talk a bit in this section about processes of how I make things to a degree, and also how I pick things. Maybe I won't, we'll see. This piece, you can do it if you're being cute, it was the first piece I properly made with leaf blocks. It incorporated some of the terrazzo effects I'd used on the early columns to make it feel as if it had been excavated, not evacuated, from the future, and finally reckoned with the monolith form that I dreamt of for so long. So as you can see, hopefully through some of these images, you see a lot of my work is taking a few tangents, I guess, where these titles come from, and sort of building up the layers like a tapestry from the sort of really specific things that I've, both the skills that I've developed as an artist and the motifs, icons that I choose to use. Because of the simple nature of the form and its universality and recognisability, I've adapted it into many forms through my work. I've sort of approached the leaf block as a sort of personalised logo. I'm trying to make so many things that I can claim a copyright on it. Also, a pair of earrings, again, using the same motif. But the idea is this leaf block object becomes something that it's so recognisable for everyone. Almost, I'm sure everyone in this that's watching this will have seen these. You'll know where you've seen one. And if you haven't noticed one before, you'll probably notice one the next time you go out. And they feel an inherently British object, but they actually originated in California. They're part of the modernist movement of these sort of screen walls used in, amazing piece of architecture with light and shade. And I guess they don't have the same ring in England with, overcast skies and the ability to grow moss on them really quickly. So this piece, did you like that? This is a piece that I'm going to talk through, I guess, my production process, because this is how I make a lot of my work now, and I guess it gives a different insight into the sculptural process. So this piece is constructed of 60 individual cast leaf blocks that are based on the same previous leaf block designs, but they've been reformatted into a slightly smaller size, and they're rounded to 60 degrees. So the idea came for this was when I was looking at the leaf block walls in the beginning, I was thinking about building certain sculptures or certain structures with these leaf blocks. And I guess part of me, maybe it's because I've got like this little bit of like design background or the chair background that I was talking about earlier, it never sat well that there was no true way to make a corner of the intersection of these leaf blocks. And I thought about mitering a joint onto them and all sorts of crazy ways to join it. But I thought the most aesthetic version of this would be to create an actual rounded block. So 3D printing's become part of my practice over the last few years. And I knew that I'd be able to manufacture a block in this way. So this is the initial sketch of ideas to see whether it was actually a possibility to sort of bend a block across an axis. And the computer said yes. So I took it to that stage, and then here's a rendering from the next stage of the process, and it just showed me how many blocks that I'm going to need to put in a tower, sort of dimensions of everything. And it's a really good way of working if you can access SketchUp just to sort of rough things out. Start manufacturing these blocks from there. Going backwards. Okay, so that's an image of the first block being printed on my 3D printer, and that just becomes something that has to be finalised and then mastered. And then once it's been mastered, it gets cast. So inside there is a silicone jacket that's surrounded by a plaster mould, and this is the form that I took to cast all of these works. So if you see on there, you see the bridge. So they've all got a really smooth exterior and then a rough interior, because they cast that way up and then smooth troweled on the back. So they've got kind of, a handmade element to them, and none of them, after the first few, like the sort of mould deforms, and you battle to keep them perfectly together. That's just some photos of the production process. So that's, you have different problems with making this with concrete as a material. Like, you can use it so many times, but you've got to change its elasticity and form to get it into these sort of moulds. And also because every time I end up doing a project like this, I always want to do 100 times more things than I need to do in far less of a time frame. So I'm always trying to work out a way to cast things faster, to demold things faster. And here you'll see on some of the images, some of the mistakes that get made, or concrete going off too fast, or, general other problems with the concrete. This is just studio experimentation. This is sort of, starting to assemble things. I like to play with different lighting and things in the studio just to see how it'd look from a sort of aesthetic point of view, I guess. There's a picture of me stood in front of it for scale. And there's the final piece. So originally it was in a show called Index, which was curated by Eric Thorpe and Nicholas Stavry, and that was a space in Whitechapel where it was for 2 weeks. And then last summer I submitted it into the summer exhibition, and there it is in the Royal Academy. Okay, chapter 5. This is the final chapter, icons. Okay, so this first work is shown in 2 vitrines at the exhibition was called Absinthe, and it was a pub called the Spit and Sawdust in London. It was a big group show, and these vitrines are made by another artist, Victor Seawood. So there's 2 vitrines, and one of them existed on the outside of the Royal College of Art in London, and the one on the right, as you look at it, was originally designed to host different kinds of mini vitrine-esque exhibitions. But here I took the form of the vitrine with this amazing light in the top and changed it into, or not changed it into, but I guess I gave it sort of those claw machines that you find, in amusement parks. In the other vitrine is a recreation of the Chachapoyan idol from Indiana Jones. This was chosen because the vitrine was a smaller object, and it was supposed to be like a museum-esque object. And because the way it was lit, there was sort of an intermediate light that came on whenever people had walked past. So it's actually in quite a dark setting. So it had kind of a sort of a haunted house, fun fair-esque effect. But then with the plinth in it, the plinth's a very deliberate sort of modifier to give it the impression that it's a weightier, more significant object than it is, which of course it's not. It's just gold painted 3D print. So the relationship between the works in there, so there's the golden idol on the left, and then on the right there's miniature golden idols, as well as other museum gift shop items that I wanted to buy but haven't ever been able to buy, if that makes sense. And they've come from sort of my own personal interest in myths. And there's the head of Venus de Milo, a statue of Ariadne who's in the painting by Di Chirico, and a couple of different Corinthian capitals, and they're sort of miniature objects priced at a point as if you'd find them in a museum gift shop. So the idol from Indiana Jones, I'm gonna have to read this one out. Yeah, so the idol in Indiana Jones was based off of a statue that was supposedly found in South America, but so I've just lost my notes on that. The prop has its own unique history. It was designed after Dumbarton Oak's birthing figure, a possible Aztec artefact, but something which most scholars now believe was made in the 19th century. In the mid-1990s, a prop replica called Icons planned to reduce a replica of the idol for sale to the general public And despite prototypes going ahead, the project was never completed. The prop's reputation precedes itself and is now somewhat of a genuine idol itself, continuing to be repeated and distributed within popular culture. So I'm cooking in here now. I just put my radiator on and I'm on fire. So there's a close-up of the tiny little idols and the other works in the vitrine. This is another work that I made from Indiana Jones. It was for a show called The Potion Room, curated by Georgia Stevenson. And the idea behind the show was it was sort of a really large format group show where people could only submit sort of really small objects. So I think there was 40 or 42 artists, and all the works, the idea behind the Potion Room, they had like a slightly magical nature to them. So this work I chose is called Holy Shit, and it's a recreation of the Cup of Christ from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So I guess this sort of final section, I guess I call it my Spielberg section, because a lot of these works are sort of based on Spielberg films, especially Indiana Jones and Jurassic Park. So this is probably one of the newest works that I've made. It's called The Land That Time Forgot. I made this in September of last year, and it was for a show with Thorpe Stavery in an abandoned swimming pool on the Walworth Road in Elephant and Castle. And I'd found this object. It's one of the few shows where I'd found the object before I actually, went into making the show. And I'd sort of been toying with the idea of casting this Jurassic Park. I think I've got the picture of it. So yeah, this is, in fact, I've got the actual thing. This was a VHS that I did as a child that it's one of my sort of most treasured possessions. And it's a special edition Jurassic Park VHS that had all the textures of the sort of first dig from the film. And I imagined this as a sort of object becoming a fossil in its own time. Again, with the idea of like VHS, finishing as a medium. As well, so yeah, also during my childhood, sort of Friday nights always meant going to Blockbuster, and you'd see huge displays of just the same product over and over again. So, I already had this object cast and sort of intending what to do with it, and it was the ideas behind the method of display that sort of led me to this. Originally, again, I knew I was going to produce a quantity of them, and it was just how to show them. But I went for the site visit at this site and saw this alcove, and it immediately asked in my mind for some sort of like shelving unit to be across the alcove, or for them to be spilling down in some way, which became this sort of Blockbuster-esque stack of videos like this. So there's some close-ups from the exhibition. And the final work that I want to talk about today is called... I've just lost my notes here. Take what you can, give nothing back, and it's named after the quote from Pirates of the Caribbean, said by Captain Jack Sparrow. And the idea behind that is that it's sort of like an amalgamation of lots of different pieces of my own work, of other people's culture. These caryatids at the top of the fountain are based off caryatids in the British Museum, which were taken from Greece by Lord Elgin, as long as the other Elgin marbles. Again, I've taken sort of ideas from the fountain at Witley Court. And last summer, when it was when lockdown was sort of over, well, for that bit that it was over, I went and had quite a few drinks in a friend's garden, and his parents had all these like amazing statues everywhere, sort of bird baths and, you know, weird garden centre statues. And I saw this, what's known as a Three Graces fountain. And it was such an amazing object. It reminded me straight away of the Caryatids. I started looking more into the Three Graces fountain. This is a Three Graces fountain in Montpellier. So this like the work is actually sort of a, you know, sort of theft and mashup of all these collision of ideas, as well as like sneaking in some of my own leaf blocks. And if I just go back, these are works that, well, this is a work that existed not long after I'd made the first set of columns, and it was the planned work for another show. So, you know, the difference in time between these two works is probably 4 months, but this had all been put away. But those sort of ideas had been retained to that eventually get developed and swallowed into this fountain. So again, that's just another fabrication shot from the fountain. And this is a bar that I built at home, again, before the Bold Tendencies work had sort of even been conceived. But you can start to see these sort of ideas forming around fountains and pumps and leaf blocks and caryatids at the bottom. And again, back to Vegas, this is like, you know, this image, these caryatids and the columns. I guess I want to close it out by saying that all these sort of influences build up such a history of layers, and they're from personalised experiences. And I think even putting this presentation together today, you start to see where the ideas come from in a much deeper and richer tapestry than I probably even realised when I'm making half of these things. You know, you look back at these works and you go, oh yeah, you know, that came from that. And I guess this came from Las Vegas. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Jack. That was fascinating. I remember coming to your studio and looking at this terrazzo polystyrene, which was quite an extraordinary. I love the way that you choose your materials and what you choose to focus on, these kind of different objects made of specific materials that you kind of organize into a language that talks about history and talks about archaeology, but also very much about how we view all that. So I was wondering if this has kind of changed your world, because you were born into a generation that was on the receiving end of a brand new digital culture. It kind of started, you know, you went from VHS to you know, you saw the great extinction of blockbusters, as you were saying. So how much has that kind of influenced or mediated history for you? And do you think you have a story to tell about how we see history?
I think at the time you don't realise it's happening. I guess probably if you spoke to anyone of a generation that had original vinyls, you know, so much you hear said is, oh, I wish I'd saved all those. You know, imagine what the records would be worth if I had all those records still that I used to have. And I guess I guess partly I'm a hoarder, and you know, I don't like throwing away things that aren't broken. But nothing was saved for a particular purpose. It just, you know, it just sort of happens. My parents have got a nice big loft and they let me save everything. But I guess you transition through those things, and then now they retain a different purpose. You know, they've got a post-rationalised purpose with what I'm making now. And so, you know, and these things are objects that I've had, but I've lost down the years. So actually the Jurassic Parks that I've got, that I'm casting from, aren't objects that I actually own anymore because it was lost. So I've had to go through a process of repurchasing all these things. And it's weird because obviously things get destroyed in this process and you have a different relationship with the materials than if you were casting your own sort of sentimental things. But you sort of rue what's been lost and how hard it is to get the things that you once took for granted. And I guess if we could all take blockbusters again for granted, would we still be going and renting films? Like, maybe, for sure.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting, the way you discuss the materialism of that surrounded you when you were growing up, and the aesthetics and what people's front doors look like, and all these things that you pick up. And but do you think that we're at a stage where materialism is, I mean, sometimes I feel that materialism is dissipating into something else. I don't know are you trying to kind of hold things for the things they are, that, might be.
I guess in a way, like, I never really think about my work as being autobiographical as such, but in a way, inherently is. And I guess it's what I have to do what I do is select certain objects that talk about me and where I've come from and things that I've been interested in. I feel like it's really important to have that honesty with the object, because otherwise you can just start picking things left, right and centre, and there's sort of, it becomes an irrelevant sort of mess of just stuff, and which can work really well sometimes. But the objects that I'm finding have I feel like they have a wider resonance, whether it's to do with the apocalypse or other people's nostalgia. Like Jurassic Park's been one of these ones that's really, I'd say, it's really easy for people to get really quickly and get on board with, because they've got that experience of either Blockbuster or Jurassic Park. And there's something wider as well about that message. Like, lots of kids grew up and loved dinosaurs, but there's also something now about the message of, of playing God and destroying cultures and, pushing things beyond the limit of probably what's safe in many things.
And extinctions in general. I had a few other questions, but I think we're running out of time.
Sorry, I missed the time.
Yeah, but never mind. But I think we do have questions ready, I think. Leanne, were you going to?
Yeah, no worries. So we have got 2 questions. So the first question is from Georgia. Thank you, Georgia. If you have time to answer, would love to know what's inspiring you at the moment and what will come next, Jack.
So at the moment, I'm working on a show with, I think I can say this, with my good friend Craig David Parr, who will also be showing with Meadow Arts later this year. And the show is going to take place in his basement that is covered in black mould and a generally completely gnarly environment. And it's about works that are going to live down there for a year. I believe I'm saying this right. If Craig can put me right, if not. But I was thinking about things that go away for a while, and also the last year, and the sort of experience. And I had COVID in last April, like nearly a year ago now. I was back up in Mansfield working as a labourer again during that whole period. But when I had COVID, I had to obviously isolate for 2 weeks on my own. So I chose to spend that isolation on the PS4, and I played the sort of remake of Doom. And I guess Doom for me was like, it was the first game I played on the computer as a child at like 8 years old. I remember inserting the floppy disks of this Doom game and then sort of replaying it again in what's essentially like just a modernised visual version of that original game. But it just felt like, again, at the time, Doom as a as a metaphor or an allegory for the entire year 2020. And I guess this year at the moment seems, it's kind of bleak, but there's, there's a silliness about doom. So anyway, that's where I'm going. I've got these pieces that I'm working on, which are these cast concrete floppy disks. You can see those. So they're replicas from the original Doom disc that I used to have. Again, something that just got lost in history at some point. I've had to rebuy the sort of original things. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Great, thanks for sharing, Jack. So after Georgia, Juliet has asked, is there a project that haunts you in that it's just been too impossible to realise as yet?
Yeah, I've got many projects like that. I mean, the sort of scale of these things can, blows out of proportion. One that comes to mind is that I'd like to... Everything that I imagine on those sort of scales is so deep and involved, they almost stop becoming artworks and end up becoming recreations of like levels from Doom or Roman cities, or an amalgamation of those two things. I hope that one day I'll get to realise something like that in a physical sculptural form, but I assume most likely it'll come as some sort of VR experience, as it seems to be the way everything's going now.
I can see that. Okay. And then Craig David Parr has asked, what was the biggest differences between West Notts and CSM, which is Central St Martin's for everybody, I assume?
I'd probably say in a wider context, doing an art foundation at your local college, if they've got good facilities, is probably like one of the most joyous and liberal times in an artist's life as a maker, and being able to like move between mediums and formats and basically do whatever you want without being tainted by the sort of real world. Like you hit everything with an absolute naivety, and I think the real difference was just being able to have a fun time with friends without it being really serious at West Arts, at foundation at a sort of local college. I think when it gets to art school, I mean, there's more distractions as well. You're older and there's more going out to do and everything else. But yeah, I'd say in terms of like the nurture from the tutors is so much deeper at foundation level than you're lost in a big corporate system. I'd say at CSM, you're in a big new building. It's full of corporate machines trying to stop you doing what you want.
Fair comparison. Okay. And we've got one more question from Sean. When your studio is the subject of an archaeological dig in 1,000 years, what are you looking forward to the archaeologists being most confused by?
What will they find? I mean, if it's... they'll find it. They'll think it's a landfill site at the moment because I've got that much rubbish everywhere around. They'll think, why is this landfill site here? I don't know. Hopefully they try and put a story together and are completely confounded by what the materials are themselves. The idea that if they were to find this, so I've got some of the things I've been casting. So I've got like this Game Boy. That's been cast, and that's just in concrete. One of these is in Jesmonite, but the idea of them doing material samples on them, and I've got like the original Game Boy over there, and the idea that they'll find those two things together, and I imagine this sort of future, it'll be so abstract that we'll like completely obliterate any memory or knowledge of Earth ever being a creative force, that whoever comes to Earth will be like, there'll be some colonising force that knows nothing of art or creativity, and they'll be so mesmerised by all these things that they won't understand the differences between the two materials.
Okay, awesome. So without further ado, it is 5:30 now. We're running over a little bit, so we have finished. And I just want to take the time to say thank you so much, Jack, for a lovely talk.
Thank you.
And stay safe, everybody. We're back on the 8th of March with Deanne Crooks at 4:30.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.